room and waiting for his turn to be called. Today is the first day of Layla's job interview. Apply as secretary. Sometime later, Layla was called. She entered the boss's room and was shocked because Layla's boss turns out to be her ex-boyfriend, Edward. Edward smirked and chuckled, "Sit down," in a commanding and firm tone. Edward's gaze watched your every move, studying each detail. He had seen many beautiful women, but Layla had always stood out. "Layla, correct?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. Edward smirked, his eyes gleaming with mischief as he took in her reaction. "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you here, especially as a secretary." He leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curled up in a teasing smile. His eyes roamed over her figure, taking in every curve. He had missed her presence, though he would never admit it. "You've grown up, haven't you?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. Edward picked up her CV, his eyes skimming over the details. "Impressive qualifications, huh?" he said, his gaze lingering on her face. Despite her cold demeanor, he couldn't help but feel a pang of familiarity. Edward, on the other hand, seemed amused by her cold demeanor. He chuckled softly, finding her attempts to be professional amusing. "You don't have to act so cold, you know. We have a history," he said, his voice laced with a hint of playfulness. Edward continued to read through her CV, his eyes occasionally flickering up to glance at her. He couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu, the memories of their time together coming back to him. "It says here you're a fashion designer." He raised a brow, intrigued. "A rather successful one, too." "Impressive," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of admiration. He set the CV down on the table and looked up at her, his gaze intense. Edward leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Congratulations, you're hired," he said, his voice firm and commanding. He knew this could be an interesting opportunity, having Layla so close to him again. Gaze held hers for a moment longer, almost as if he was trying to read her thoughts. "You'll start tomorrow. Be here at 8 a.m. sharp," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As her boss, he expected absolute obedience. Edward knew that having her as his secretary would have its challenges, but he was willing to take those risks. "And Layla, one more thing," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "You should remember, you're working for me. I expect absolute loyalty and professionalism. No room for distractions." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Understand?" Edward's gaze softened slightly at her nod, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He was satisfied with her response, but he knew there was more. There was still an underlying tension between them. "Good." He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You may go now. Come back tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp." Edward was sitting in his office, his mind occupied with thoughts of Layla. It had been a week since she started working as his secretary, and he had been watching her closely, trying to discern if she still had feelings for him. He couldn't deny the attraction that still existed between them, despite their long past relationship. It was something that had never faded for him. As he sat at his desk, a sense of restlessness overcame him. He couldn't focus on work, his mind constantly going back to Layla. He knew he had to tell her how he still felt, but how could he? They were co-workers. No, he was her boss. He pushed aside the stack of papers on his desk and stood up, pacing around the room. The more he tried to ignore his feelings, the stronger they grew. It was almost as if his heart was refusing to let go, stubbornly clinging onto the connection they had once shared. Edward stopped pacing and turned to face Layla. His gaze locked onto her, his expression serious, yet there was a hint of vulnerability. "I need to talk to you," he said. He approached her, closing the distance between them. His eyes searched hers, looking for any indication of what she might be thinking, how she might be feeling. "It's about us," he said, pausing as if to gauge her reaction. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the years-long unspoken feelings heavy on his mind. He had been trying to bury his emotions, to be the stoic boss who knew no weakness, but every time he saw her, every time she said his name, it felt like a fresh reminder of what he had lost, what he still wanted. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Layla, I need to tell you something." His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. He was standing close enough to her that he could touch her, but instead he balled his hands into fists, restraining himself. I still have feelings for you," he said firmly, his eyes searching hers for any reaction. "I never stopped. All these years, no matter how much I tried to push them away, they were always there." His voice was rough with vulnerability. He closed the final distance between them, his body almost touching hers. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, but he held back, not wanting to push her too far too quickly. "Layla, I need to know if you still feel anything for me, or if it's all in my head. I can't keep this up if it's just one-sided. I need to know."